The arena was empty, but the dust still lingered in the air like breath that refused to settle. A massive grey bull stood alone in the center, muscles twitching beneath a hide scarred by time and defiance. His name was Oathkeeper. Outside the fence, an old man stood motionless, eyes like worn stone. And for a heartbeat, the beast looked back, as if he remembered him. They called it the Dust Valley Stampede, an annual show of grit, noise, and broken bones, hosted on the sprawling Merrick Ranch in western Texas. Crowds came for the chaos, for the spectacle of men trying to conquer beasts that wanted nothing but freedom. But not Walter Boone. He swept floors at the county farmers' market and spent his nights at Ellie's bedside, whispering stories while machines hummed life into her fragile body. At 12, Ellie had more grace than many grown men, but her kidneys were failing fast, and the waiting list was long, too long, when Clayton Merrick, the ranch's swaggering millionaire owner, announced a prize of $80,000 to anyone who could ride Oathkeeper for 10 seconds. Most men laughed. No one dared. Walter didn't laugh, because to him, that money meant more than pride. This is a story about quiet strength, instinct, and the bond no one ever saw coming. But that afternoon, something happened no one expected. Walter Boone didn't belong in the crowd. While others wore brimmed hats and shiny buckles, he wore a faded work shirt stained with time and a pair of boots that had long since stopped pretending to be waterproof. He stood at the edge of the ranch grounds, arms crossed, eyes quietly scanning the chaos ahead. He'd once been a ranch hand, years ago, before his back stiffened and before the hospital visits began. Now he was just the man who pushed a mop through the fairgrounds after dusk and made soup from whatever the neighbors didn't sell. Every week he sent half of what he made to pay for Ellie's medicine. Every night he prayed the machines wouldn't stop humming. The world had become very small for Walter. A hospital room, a borrowed trailer, and the distant sound of hooves on dirt. He had no business near the arena where Oathkeeper thundered behind steel gates, his breath fogging in the afternoon heat. No business watching the showboats and professionals size each other up. But there was something about that bull, grey, massive, and untouchable. Oathkeeper had thrown every rider he'd faced, some after 2 seconds, most in less than 1. None had stayed on. None had even come close. Walter had only ever seen him from a distance during early cleanup shifts, but once, just once, their eyes had met. Through a gap in the holding pen. There was no violence in that moment. No challenge, just recognition. That memory echoed now as he watched Clayton Merrick step onto the platform, surrounded by cameras and local sponsors. Merrick's voice boomed over the speakers. $80,000 to anyone who can last 10 seconds on Oathkeeper. Let's see who's got the guts. The crowd roared. Names were called, jokes were made, but no one stepped forward. Walter's hands tightened on the railing. His body said no. But something deep in his chest stirred, something older than fear, a feeling he hadn't known since his wife passed, since the hospitals began replacing churches in his life. He looked toward the beast again, and this time, Oathkeeper was already watching. Walter Boone didn't sleep that night. He sat beside Ellie's hospital bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest beneath a wool blanket far too heavy for her frame. The machines beeped softly, steady but slow. Nurses came and went with tired eyes and polite nods. They all knew him now. "Mr. Boone again?" they'd ask. And he'd nod, smile, offer thanks. But he was growing tired of being recognized for his quiet suffering. The next morning, after folding Ellie's scarf and kissing her forehead, Walter took the long walk back to the ranch grounds. He didn't plan on talking to anyone, but he wanted to see Oathkeeper again. What he found was laughter. Clayton Merrick stood with a group of local riders, joking loud enough for the whole camp to hear. "Old man Boone's been staring at my bull like he wants to marry it," he said, his voice slick with mockery. "Maybe we should get him a saddle for his walker." The men burst into cruel laughter. Walter stood a few yards away. He didn't speak. He just looked down at his hands. Hands that had pulled calves from mothers, fixed fences through thunderstorms, and now trembled just from holding a soup can too long. He turned to leave. But then a voice cut through the noise. It was Earl Tuckett, Merrick's foreman. "Boss," Earl said, half joking, "what if we let him try?" Clayton raised an eyebrow. "What? Boone? On Oathkeeper?" The group roared again. "Why not?" Merrick grinned. "We'll put on a show. Free ticket for whoever wants to see a fossil get stomped. Call it charity." That word burned. Charity. As if Walter's life, his love for his granddaughter, was a sideshow to entertain the well-fed. But he didn't react. Not with words. Later that afternoon, he walked back to the stables, alone. No audience, no cameras. Just the creak of wood and the earthy scent of hay. Oathkeeper stood in his pen, unusually still. Walter approached the fence slowly. Not with the swagger of a rider, with reverence, as if coming to ask permission. The bull turned his head, nostrils flaring, and then something strange happened. He didn't rear, didn't stomp. He just stared, as if he'd been waiting. Walter placed one hand on the top rail, heart pounding. "I don't need a show," he whispered. "I just need a chance." But no one heard him. Not the men laughing around their campfire, not the system that let Ellie's dialysis wait behind paperwork, not even the judges in the arena. Only Oathkeeper stood still, listening, and somewhere in that silence, something broke, quietly, irreversibly. The days that followed bled together like dusk into dark. Walter walked from the hospital to the ranch and back again, always alone, always ignored. The town knew his story. Some pitied him, most forgot him. At the market, he tried selling his toolbox, a rusted thing filled with old wrenches and memories of younger hands. The buyer offered $10 and a shrug. "It's all I can do," Walter said, his voice calm. Resigned. He'd already tried the church, the mayor's office, even the local radio station. No one could or would help. Too old, too poor, too quiet. Back at the ranch, the posters went up. "Can you last 10 seconds on the beast? Come watch history at Merrick Arena." They used a photo of Oathkeeper midair, eyes wild and hooves frozen in a death dance. Below the image, in bright letters, $80,000 cash prize, if you dare. Walter didn't laugh. He just read the date. It was in 3 days. That night, Ellie had a fever. She mumbled in her sleep, calling for her mother, who died 5 years earlier. Walter sat by her side, wiping her brow with a damp cloth and whispering prayers too worn to echo. She woke at dawn, barely able to open her eyes. "Grandpa," she said, voice dry. "I'm here, baby." Her hand reached for his. "Do you think we'll get to see the ocean someday?" He nodded, even as something cracked inside him. "Of course," he lied. "Someday soon." The next morning, Walter showed up at the ranch gates. Earl Tuckett, Merrick's foreman, spotted him and smirked. "Thought you'd finally come to your senses," he said. "Looking for a janitor shift?" Walter looked him in the eye. "No," he said simply. "I want to ride." Earl blinked, the smirk fading. "You serious?" Walter nodded. "You got a death wish, Boone? That bull's thrown kids half your weight clean out the sky." "I'm not trying to win anything," Walter said, "just trying not to lose her." That shut Earl up. Still, he didn't say yes. Walter wasn't on the list. He wasn't even supposed to be near the chute. But that night, after the crowds had left, Walter stood outside Oathkeeper's pen again. No saddle, no rope, no crowd, just him, the bull, and the wind. And that's when something shifted. Oathkeeper paced, then stopped, then turned. Their eyes locked. The bull pawed the dirt once, not violently, deliberately, as if answering. On the day of the event, Merrick wore a pearl-button shirt and gold-stamped boots. He paced the announcer's booth like a preacher on Sunday, soaking in the cheers. "We've got a packed lineup today, folks, and maybe a surprise," he winked. Then he saw Walter, waiting at the side gate. Merrick's face twisted. "You still at this?" he barked. "You'll break your damn back before the gate even opens." Walter didn't reply. A few bystanders laughed. Others fell silent. Something about the way the old man stood, calm, steady, made the air feel thicker. "You don't have the right," Merrick hissed, stepping closer. "This is my show." Walter looked toward the arena. "I'm not here for your show." Earl approached, hat in hand. He looked at Walter, then at Merrick. "The rules say anyone can ride if they sign the waiver," he muttered. "We got it printed. Just saying." Merrick stared, then spat at the ground. "Let him die, then." As Walter walked toward the holding chute, the crowd began to murmur. Some laughed, some booed. Most watched in a strange hush, like something ancient was unfolding and they didn't yet understand. Oathkeeper stood ready, nostrils flared, rope hanging loose. Walter climbed the fence slowly. His hands shook, not from fear but from weight, the weight of nights holding a child too weak to cry, the weight of being unseen for too long. He settled his frame against the bull. No saddle, no leverage. Just bone, breath, and belief. Earl pulled the gate lever. The crowd inhaled. But before the gate slammed open, before the hooves thundered, Oathkeeper paused. And in that pause you could almost hear it. The silence that comes right before something holy begins. The gate clanged open like a gunshot, but Oathkeeper didn't explode forward. He stepped out slow, controlled, his hooves sinking deep into the churned dirt. The crowd, waiting for a frenzy, leaned forward. But the bull didn't buck, didn't lurch, didn't rage. Walter sat atop him, knees loose, back curved from age and gravity. His hand rested gently on the bull's withers, not gripping, just being. No rodeo clock started. No one shouted. No one knew what to make of what they were seeing. The arena, usually wild with noise, went still. Oathkeeper took 3 steps forward, each one deliberate, like walking through fog. Then he stopped, turned his head slightly, and let out a low breath, a sound more like a sigh than a snort. On his back, Walter didn't smile, didn't wave. He simply closed his eyes for a second and listened, as if the beast beneath him had become part of his heartbeat. Merrick stood frozen in the booth, mic limp in his hand. "Why isn't he bucking?" someone whispered. Earl Tuckett removed his hat. "He's not trying to throw him," he said quietly. "He's carrying him." A gasp rippled through the stands. Somewhere near the top row, a child whispered to her mother, "Is he magic?" But this wasn't magic. It was something older, older than showmanship, older than ego. It was trust without language, respect without rules. Walter had nothing to prove. Oathkeeper had nothing to fight. 2 lives weathered by time had simply recognized each other. The bull turned again, this time with purpose, and made a slow circle around the arena, as if parading something sacred, not to be applauded, but to be honored. By the time they stopped, nearly a full minute had passed. Not 10 seconds. 60. Stillness fell again. Then Walter leaned forward, placed one hand on Oathkeeper's thick neck, and whispered something no one could hear, but the bull heard. He gave one final breath, and stood still. Not defeated, not broken, just seen. No one moved. It was as if the arena had turned into a cathedral. Walter slid off Oathkeeper's back with the stiffness of old bones, landing slow, knees buckling just slightly. The bull didn't flinch, just watched him, calm and still, like a soldier standing at ease. Then Walter turned and started walking away, boots crunching softly through the dirt. Only then did the crowd begin to shift. Some clapped, hesitant, unsure if this counted as a victory. Others stayed silent, eyes glazed in something that looked like reverence. There had been no fireworks, no dust storm, no timer screaming numbers on a screen, but everyone in that arena felt it. They had just seen something true. In the booth, Clayton Merrick stood motionless, mouth parted slightly, as if trying to form a response. But what could he say? The old man had done the impossible, without violence, without permission, without him. He reached for the microphone, then paused. Someone else was already speaking. Earl Tuckett, standing near the rails, voice steady. "You all saw it," he said, loud enough to carry. "You all felt it. A low murmur swept the crowd like wind through tall grass. Someone shouted, "He won!" Another voice echoed, "That was more than a win!" Children stood on benches. Elderly folks wiped at their cheeks. Even the riders, young, prideful, stood with their hats off, staring like boys at a fire they couldn't explain. Walter reached the edge of the arena and stopped. Oathkeeper was still watching. Their eyes met one last time, not like predator and prey, but like equals. And then, quietly, the bull turned and walked away, alone, majestic, unguarded, back into the chute. No ropes, no handlers, as if he'd finished his part in something no one would ever fully understand. Walter looked down at his hands. They were shaking, but not from fear, from release. The weight he'd carried, days, months, years, had lifted just enough for him to breathe again. But it wasn't over, not yet. Clayton Merrick slammed the mic down on the table, rattling the entire booth. "That wasn't a ride," he barked to no one in particular. "That was a walk, a trick." But no one echoed his anger. Earl stood near the gate, arms folded. "If it's so easy," he said, not raising his voice, "you get on him." Merrick's face flushed. The cameras were still rolling. Phones were still recording, and the man who ran this whole spectacle was suddenly no longer the main character. He stormed out of the booth, pushing past a group of stunned spectators. Down on the arena floor, Walter had just reached the back gate when Merrick caught up. "You think this earns you anything?" he snapped. "That bull let you ride? That's not skill, that's luck." Walter turned, steady as ever. "I never said it was skill," he replied. "I just showed up." Merrick snorted. "You're not getting a dime. The deal was for a real ride." A few people gasped. "You made the challenge," someone in the crowd shouted. "Don't back out now," another added. But Merrick raised his hand. There was no 8-second clock, no rodeo protocol. Just an old man and a lazy bull. That's not sport. That's a stunt. Walter didn't argue, didn't plead. He just looked Merrick in the eyes and said, "I wasn't here for sport," and turned to leave. That somehow infuriated Merrick more than any insult. "You walk out now, Boone, you walk out with nothing," he growled. But before Walter could answer, Earl stepped between them. "He walks out with more than any of us ever will," the foreman said. The tension in the air sharpened. Merrick's fists clenched. His mouth twitched, but he couldn't strike a man like Walter, not here, not now, not after what they'd all just witnessed. Still, the threat lingered. Behind the curtains, behind the crowd, behind the fame, he still held the power. And Walter knew it. He didn't fear Merrick, but he feared one thing, that the promise he'd made to Ellie might still break under the weight of someone else's pride. The sun had begun to drop behind the hills, casting long shadows across the arena. Everything looked golden, suspended, like the day itself was holding its breath. Walter Boone stood still. He wasn't angry. He wasn't begging. But something inside him cracked, not in despair, but in resolve. He turned back toward Merrick, slow and calm, and said just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "You said anyone who stayed on for 10 seconds would earn that money. No timer?" Merrick shot back. "No rules followed." "I didn't follow your rules," Walter nodded. "I followed his." He looked toward the far end of the arena. Oathkeeper was still there, standing by the chute, unmoving, watching. Walter took a breath and stepped back into the arena. The crowd murmured. People stood again. A low, pulsing anticipation filled the air, confused, reverent, almost like watching someone walk into a storm they chose. As Walter approached, the great bull didn't bolt. He walked toward the man, 2 steps, then another, until they met in the center. And there, without rope or saddle, Walter placed a hand on Oathkeeper's side and pulled himself up once more. A second ride, but not for money, not for show, for proof. He nodded gently, and Oathkeeper began to move, this time faster, stronger, testing. The arena erupted, not in cheers but in awe. You could feel the sound rising like a tide. Oathkeeper kicked once, a powerful thrust of muscle and memory. Walter held on, not with brute strength but balance, trust, grace. Another kick, then a twist. Still, Walter stayed. He bent with the motion, flowed with it, didn't resist it. 8 seconds, 9, 10, 12. The crowd gasped, even the official timer. Someone finally thought to start it, clicked red numbers on a portable screen. 15, 17. Then, without warning, Oathkeeper slowed, stopped, and lowered his head. Walter slid off again, knees buckling slightly, breath ragged, chest heaving. Merrick stood stone still. The crowd began to clap, not rowdy, but slow, deep, from the gut. The sound of people who had just witnessed something they didn't have words for. Merrick looked around, and for the first time, no one was looking at him. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, started walking forward, face pale, eyes distant. Walter turned, but didn't reach for it. "I didn't do it for that," he said, voice hoarse. Merrick hesitated, then looked down, really looked, for the first time. "You did it, because of her," he whispered. Walter nodded. "She's all I've got." The envelope trembled in Merrick's hand. He extended it again, slower this time. "Then let me do something right." Walter didn't take it. Not yet. But he didn't walk away either. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just a man surviving. He was a man who had been heard. Behind him, Oathkeeper stood tall and silent, watching not the crowd, not the cameras, just the old man who rode him not to conquer, but to connect. And in that stillness, they both had won. Not just against odds, but against the noise of a world that forgets the quiet ones. Weeks passed. The videos went viral before Walter even knew what the word meant. Headlines called him the man who humbled the beast, the cowboy of silence, and other names he never asked for. He didn't care. He was back at the market by the next weekend, restocking crates of squash and tomatoes. Ellie had started a new treatment in Dallas, paid in full. She still tired easily, still needed rest, but her cheeks had color again. Her laugh had returned, and that was all Walter ever wanted. At Merrick Ranch, things changed. The arena stayed, but something in its heart was different now. Loud music played softer, announcers spoke with more care, and Oathkeeper, he never bucked again. He wasn't retired, just different. He wandered the ranch pastures, calm as dusk, untethered. Riders approached him sometimes. He didn't run, but he never knelt. He had already chosen his rider. Merrick, for his part, stopped dressing like a cowboy on weekends. He spent more time walking the fence lines alone, hands in his pockets, eyes softer. One day, he renamed the arena. A new wooden sign, carved by hand, hung above the entrance. It didn't say Merrick Rodeo Grounds. It said Oathkeeper's Circle, and underneath, smaller letters, burned into the grain, for the ones who speak with silence. Walter never asked for that. He never stood beneath the sign, never took pictures, never gave interviews. He just kept showing up, quiet, steady, whole. Because some stories don't need retelling, they just need to live in the bones of those who were there. And sometimes, what changes a man is not the roar of the crowd, but the eyes of a creature that simply refused to fear him. Maybe you know someone like Walter, someone who doesn't shout, doesn't ask, just keeps going for someone they love. Or maybe you are that person. If this story found a way into your chest, even just for a moment, let it sit there. Let it breathe. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. Share where you're watching from. Tell us who you thought of while listening. Because sometimes, stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders. That strength doesn't always look like noise. Sometimes it walks with a limp. Sometimes it rides without spurs. And sometimes it doesn't ride at all. It just listens. So, if this story touched you, like it, share it, and pass it to someone who might need a little bit of stillness today. We'll be here, telling the stories that matter, the ones that speak without ever raising their voice.